Number 1. The backyard. This happened to me when I was a pre-teenager. I would say tween, but I kinda hate that word. I was still very interested in things like scouting and camping and getting all muddy with my friends. I hadn't quite gotten to girls yet, but I knew that was coming along pretty soon. But at this time, I loved any kind of camping. And although this wasn't an official scouting get-together, I wanted to do a camping out in my parents' backyard. Now, I wouldn't say we lived out in the country because we really didn't, but we had an enormous backyard. Hell, with all the places I have lived since, I'm still in awe of how big that yard was. It was great for playing with the dogs, playing baseball with my buddies. It was just great altogether. So this was in midsummer, when we were beginning to get somewhat bored of the time off from school. The days were long and monotonous, so I asked my parents if we could have the camp out in the backyard. We were all scouts and had done this before, and my parents had no problem with it. Now, one thing we did was that everyone had their own tent. I sort of preferred sleeping alone in mine anyway. But anyway, this is pretty important to tell the story. We did all the usual camping things. We indeed had a small fire, as we had a little stoned-off area that my family used to make fires. We had s'mores. That is really the reason that made me decide to tell this story, seeing someone buying things to make them in the store today. And then eventually, after talking about all the things that 12-year-old boys find important, we went to bed. I didn't know what time it was. I read a little bit by my flashlight before finally going to sleep. And I fell asleep pretty easily. The fire had been small, and we put it out before getting into our tents, so there wasn't light to keep me awake. I'm not sure what woke me up at the time, although nowadays I think it was the sound of the zipper on my tent being lowered. My head was foggy, and I couldn't see much of anything. But I noticed that there was a figure at the entryway to my tent. I immediately guessed that it was either one of the other boys, or maybe my dad had come outside for some reason. So I immediately grabbed my flashlight. I flashed it over at them to see who it was. I was good enough with the light to shine it under their head, so the light wouldn't completely blind them in the darkness. It took me less than a second to realize that the man who was coming into my tent was absolutely not my dad and was way too old to be any of my scout mates. He was, up to that point, the scariest looking person I had ever seen in my life. He had long hair, the most insane eyes I had ever seen, and a look on his face that I can simply describe as crazy. The man was on his hands and knees, and he took one crawl toward me. He then put up one of his fingers up to his lips, as if to indicate to me not to talk or make any noise. For nearly a moment I didn't, but it had everything to do with fear, not that I was listening to his advice. He made another crawl toward me, and that was all it took. I began yelling and screaming bloody murder like you couldn't imagine. I faced the other wall of the tent and did everything I could to get out of there. But of course I wasn't going to get out of there, and didn't see any lights in the house go on right away. Fortunately, however, my scout mates all woke up right away. I began screaming at them, "There's someone in my tent! There's someone in my tent!" Now, I didn't know exactly what had happened right away. I could see light through the tent, but it was too opaque for me to make out exactly what was going on outside. But one of my friends went running into the house to get my parents. But what I quickly became aware of were the other kids who quickly came to my rescue. They all attacked the guy who was trying to get me in the tent, and who had actually gotten to my foot. However, he quickly let go of that when the kids attacked him. I couldn't tell if the kids pulled him out of the tent, or if he tried to force himself out of there, despite what they were doing, but the only thing I was happy about was the fact that he was out of my tent. Next thing, I heard a gunshot though, and Then there was a lot of commotion and even some yelling from some of the other boys. I didn't come out of the tent, though, until it was my older brother coming in to get me. He rushed me and the other boys to the house, when my dad held the guy to the ground with his rifle. The police came and arrested the guy. He was found guilty of attempted kidnapping before being extradited to another state, where he was put on trial for a completed kidnapping. I don't know what happened to him, but if he died in prison, I wouldn't mind so much. I didn't go camping ever again. I just camping a tent after that. Number 2, Sleepover. I had a really frightening experience with a friend of mine when I was really young. I recall being around him a lot younger when he had an imaginary friend that he used to get teased about by other boys. They saw having an imaginary friend as something that only little girls did or really young boys. So at even a very young age for a boy to give up an imaginary friend, he took quite a bit of torment about it from the other boys. I kept being his friend because I liked him. I never had an imaginary friend of my own. I never held it against him, though. In fact, I sometimes wish I had the imagination to have one at any time during my life. We liked a lot of the same toys as each other and things like that, so we got along fine. But during the whole period of teasing, I do remember it getting a little bit too much for him, I suppose, and it was then that he quit talking about his imaginary friend. I got to mention earlier that my friend's name was Brian, and his imaginary friend was named Billy. So I guess we were maybe 7 years old when Brian stopped talking about Billy, and after that I stopped thinking about it. That is, until around the time that we were 11 years old. I remember playing over at Brian's house that day, and he seemed a little upset about something. I never thought to ask him what was wrong. I don't recall really doing that back then when I was that young. But we were playing with his Nintendo, and he kept dying really easily when it was his turn to play. This was just really unusual for him, but I don't remember mentioning it. Brian, on the other hand, asked me if I wanted to spend the night over his place that night. This was something I was always up for, actually. I liked his house a lot more than mine, and my own parents would never allow anything like a sleepover, so I readily accepted. The evening went pretty well. I always enjoyed Brian's family, plus his video games were in his bedroom, so we could play them as much as we wanted to. He seemed to be a whole lot in a better mood than he had been before. When bedtime came around, we got ready for bed. Brian had twin beds in his bedroom. I never quite understood why, unless it was for sleepovers. He never had another brother, and I know that none of his sisters slept in his room. They both had their own rooms. So, while we were talking, I was surprised that Brian asked me if I remembered Billy. Although I had not thought about him in a long time, I immediately knew who Brian was talking about. I knew he meant the imaginary friend, and not anyone we actually knew. I let him know that I did, but I didn't say much more about him. Then Brian told me. He started visiting me again. I think I was quiet for a few moments before I uttered out, "Oh? Yeah. But he's not like how I remembered him," Brian explained. "Before he was nice. He played with me a whole lot and he was pretty cool." Brian was quiet for a few moments. I have to admit to being a little afraid for the few moments of quiet, but I didn't let on that I was scared at all. "Now, he just hangs out under the bed at night," Brian said, sending a chill down my spine. "He keeps telling me that he's going to grab me and pull me under the bed when I fall asleep." I paused again before asking the question that frightened me most. "Under your bed or mine?" "Mine," Brian responded. I thought I would feel relieved that it wasn't mine, but I didn't. I was simply terrified, so I responded, "Why don't we both sleep in this bed then?" I barely had the word out of my mouth before my friend had jumped over to the bed I was in. It was just a twin, but we were small and so scared that it worked. We didn't get a lot of sleep that night. We talked through our fear until we fell asleep. But here's the weird thing. He never mentioned Billy again. It was somehow like that one night exorcised the entire fear from him. The house on Chico Road. For all our differences, my elder sister and I were very adventurous. Anything out of the ordinary called to our souls. We were both into horror and scary stories. We'd read Edgar Allan Poe, Ambrose Bierce, H.P. Lovecraft, Alfred Hitchcock, Algernon Blackwood, Daphne du Maurier, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, among others. At the time of our adventure, I was all of 13, and my sister, who I'll henceforth refer to as Jay, was 16. That day, our mother had gone out with a gay friend, and the warm spring afternoon soon allowed us to delve into a mischievous and somewhat dangerous excursion into the home of a recently deceased widow. Her husband had died some years earlier, and any children she'd had lived out of state. She died alone. I was close to my elder sister in those early years, so when she asked, "Hey Cat, let's go check out the empty house," I was all for it. We presumed the house was empty, of at least any living occupants. Long before the demise of the widow, the house had a reputation for being haunted by the widow's deceased husband. Still, any chance to get out and go exploring was something we could not pass up. Besides, the widow was also known to have never locked her front doors, so it was a perfect invitation to get in, without having to break in, which we were loath to do. Whenever I looked deeply into my sister's baby dull blue eyes, I saw her usual undying mischievous shine through. This time she was serious, and so was I. "Okay," I said, "let's go." And without another word, we headed out the front door and into the woods of the 60 acres my uncle owned in Little Rock, Arkansas. Just before we let out, Jay grabbed my wrist and said, grinning, "Wait a minute, stupid. We need a flashlight." "Oh yeah," I mouthed, absent-mindedly. In my haste, I'd nearly forgotten. But then, she was older, so she was supposed to have remembered anyway. When my mind began to work instead of being on autopilot, I realized that Jay was right. There would be no electricity. Her family, we learned from our aunt, would only see her on occasion, so we knew they would probably not show up anyway, if they showed up at all. As we walked the 1.5 miles to the house, we first had to traverse a long dirt road that would take us further away from the paved road, but get us to the old house sooner. We heard birds, all sorts, mockingbirds, blue jays, scarlet tanagers, and ravens. In the ditch along the way, we saw a family of killdeer, both mother and father with chicks, running along beside with their quick steps and thin legs that carried them from one end of a culvert to the other, their nest somewhere along the ground. I smiled at their inventiveness, the father acting like he was wounded, hopping along with a feigned broken wing to distract us and draw us away from the nest area. Jay didn't appreciate nature the way that I did. Following along, I already missed my Shiloh, a chocolate cream tortoiseshell cat. She was asleep now, but would be awaiting me on velvet paws upon my return. That cat owned me. Everything was about her until, that is, my sister Jay said those magic words that would take me from her for at least a few hours. After our little adventure, we planned on rewarding ourselves by walking another 1/2 mile or so to the little rundown mom-and-pop store, McMillan's, for a cold soda. We always called them cold drinks no matter what the drink was. and no matter what kind of cola, we always called them Coke. That was just what we Southerners called it back then. I never liked Coke, so I always got something else. The warmth of the sun shone down on us as we made our way off the dirt road, which in a few years would have a few horrors of its own for Shiloh and me, but that's another story. Jay drew me away from my thoughts of Shiloh, which they were never far from, when she said, "Gotta go this way." She turned to the left onto the narrow, tree-lined Chico Road. Dense woods lined the concrete, paved two-lane road leading to the widow's house. A scattering of homes littered the landscape along the way as we moved and joined the blooming bushes, wildflowers, and trees, breathing deep the richness of early summer, lost in my thoughts of what we might find, and taking in the shapes of the clouds that blended with a robin's egg blue sky. I barely noticed when the wind picked up, a portent of a storm later in the day. Marching along, flashlight in hand, Jay told me and herself she too was lost in thought, that we would be going into a dark house and some dark places, and thus the reason for the flashlight. She was more scared than I thought. It seemed like it took forever when I finally recognized the slight turn that preceded the front of the house. Before we rounded the corner, I asked Jay if we should take the woods to cut across the yard instead of walking in front of the house. She paused and thought about that for a moment, and then finally made up her mind with, "No, Cat," she said. "It's all right. No one knows we're here anyway. No one ever comes here." Immediately I looked into her eyes. They appeared a little clouded, indicating she was afraid. "It's just because you're scared of the woods," I teased. "Just shut up and come on." I dismissed that as big sister syndrome. Then I smiled, adding, "Okay, dummy," a face-saving jab at her earlier calling me stupid. She just glared. We moved on almost directly in front of the huge two-story house. Finally, we stepped off the road, thankful for the cool of the grass. It was pretty warm. In those days that far out in the country, there were few sidewalks and little to no shoulders on Chico Road. A second later, a car swerved a bit too close, reminding us that if we didn't pay more attention, we could become permanent residents of the house on Chico Road too. I saw an image of both of us, face planted in the road. As we moved swiftly onto the property, we looked at one another with nervous laughs. We stood for a moment to take in the excitingly ominous sight of the house. It looked like something out of a horror movie, gnarled, grotesque, and twisted shapes that would haunt your nightmares. Moved with the sudden wind. It was as if they moved of their own accord, sometimes taking the shape of creepy, dark human figures. The sounds they made were just as strange, as if they were inhabited by the spirits of the dead. Their eerie and sad howlings rose and fell, as if they were stretched and bent by the wind into long, drawn-out moans. Suddenly it dawned on me where the musical category woodwinds probably came from. I always loved the sound made by Pan's reed flute. Pan was a satyr in Greek mythology. As we moved carefully across the huge unkempt yard, twigs and sticks of old fallen branches snapped and popped under our feet, hidden in the long grass, giving us away to anything that lurked there. If the spirits weren't certain about our presence before, they were certain of it now. Jay shivered. I sure as hell know I did. Of course I didn't say the word hell out loud, just in my head. Cursing was strictly forbidden. But of course Jay did. Following her lead, I echoed the forbidden word out loud as well. I felt a little bit nervous, yet liberated doing it. The house stood completely alone, surrounded by the woods. Interestingly, only around the house were all the trees dead. Further back it was lush and green. Upon closer inspection, we had only ever seen it from the road, and realized that it was more run down and dilapidated than we thought. Grabbing my shoulder again, Jay startled me with a perfunctory, "Come on, let's go." Her left hand was firmly on my shoulder, almost pushing me ahead of her. Naturally I resisted, and she quipped that she was sorry and loosened her grip. I don't think I had ever seen her this nervous. The house seemed to yawn at our presence, as a sudden gust of warm air came seemingly from within the house. It gave our young faces a fresh scare, as our excited fright whisked our blonde hair high into the air with unseen fingers, while another wind seemed to gently usher us to the stairs that led up onto the porch. Stopping momentarily, we gazed out across the tree-strewn ravine and lake, when another sudden gust of wind blew across us and seemingly through us, accompanied by a sudden noise behind. The sound caught us both completely off guard, unnerving and hastening us onto the porch. It seems that the spirits were impatient at our hesitance. We'd come this far. Carefully we moved up the creaking stairs, the old wood too, moaning an invitation as we mounted the porch. An old porch, swing hanging from one anchor, still affixed to the ceiling, squeaked out a half-tempting, "Sit, if you dare." Our heads jerked at the sudden sound, and then back to the door. Jay moved ahead of me, letting go of my shoulder. Just long enough to grasp the knob and slowly turn. More groans of creaking wood, amidst disquieting squeaks and desperate scratchings, entered our young fertile imaginations and settled there, as a strong musty smell of old furniture, clothes, and dust invaded our nostrils. Still, it must have been quite a lovely house, I thought. Even at my age, I could appreciate the once fine architecture of this old house. It certainly must have been grand in its day. Glancing around the huge living room area, I could see, even in the gloom, the still solidly built floor that rose on one side to a low mezzanine, upon which sat a small table and 4 chairs, in the corner of which sat a white baby grand piano covered in thin dust. The aged ivory keys were partially exposed, turning them a lighter shade of gray. I was then and now a music lover. The thought of the elephants it took to make them turned my stomach. Before my sister punched me softly on my arm, I too spied the stairs on my left that led to a second story, and from there a third, or so we were told. "Come on, let's go." Cautiously, I agreed, tiptoeing across the broad hardwood floor, black oak I assumed. We again heard the squeaks, and saw a few fearless mice run across the floor, somehow knowing they were safe in our presence. One came so close that its twitching nose sniffed the toe of my shoe while in mid-stride. Slowly I reached into my jeans pocket and pulled out a treat I had intended on giving to Shiloh, but had forgotten in my rush to get there. The little gray mouse knew my intentions and took it eagerly from my thumb and forefinger and ran halfway across the floor, and then, as if to say thank you, stopped and turned to look at me, its little black eyes glistening. It winked in approval. I smiled as it squeaked and ran hurriedly with its prize to its lair, under the musty, dust-covered couch. I reflected that it probably was a good thing that my cat Shiloh wasn't with me after all, because she would have had all the mice presented to me as gifts in a matter of just a few days, depending on how many were there. And hearing quite a few squeaks and seeing a few tiny fuzzy gray bodies scatter as we entered the house, she would have certainly had her paws full. There was no way I would ever bring her here just to kill mice, even if she was the best mouser ever known to catdom. Before I knew it, Jay was already at the piano. She just had to touch everything. She simply could not resist doing so. I shook my head. "Oh, come on, Jay, really?" She stopped just for an instant and looked at me with that huge, mischievous smile of hers. Tucking the faded white key cover further back into the piano, exposing the dust-free keys, I joined her just as the felt hammer struck a single string and rang out an off-key tang into the quiet solitude of the room. She giggled softly and then moved towards a single door in the middle of the far wall that we thought was another room. It turned out to be the balcony. She opened it slowly. As soon as we retreated outside, we heard footsteps moving down what sounded like the stairs. The dark gloom of the house suddenly seemed to close in tighter around us. I now held the flashlight as instructed by Jay, whipping it in the direction of the sound. First up, and then down, and then widely about the room itself, as if expecting to catch a glimpse of something. Instead, the light caught Jay's widened and very frightened eyes, and her pupils shrinking to tiny pinpoints. Quickly her hand came up, grabbing the flashlight, whispering harshly, "Get it out of my eyes, dumbbell!" And with that wrenched it out of my hands, turning it off at the same time. Then the door to the balcony slammed shut. Standing perfectly still, I looked toward Jay and she back at me, our eyes wide, trying to figure out how. The wind couldn't have done that, could it? They say there's a fine line between a genius and an idiot. My sister Jay was brilliant at times, but I quickly deduced that her decision to hang out on the balcony with only one exit clearly put her on the complete and absolute idiot side of the equation. Of course, there was still the bedroom window, except it would be quite a drop should we need to escape that way. My mind told me it couldn't have been a ghost, but I was the first to move to the door because we, in our suddenly clouded state of mind, were decidedly screwed in this situation, should it be anything worse. We could not drop from the balcony. The incline of the hill it was built on proved to be too steep, and the small black water lake was a little too close for comfort. Taking the lead, I whispered, "Come on, Jay. There's nowhere else to go." Meekly, she nodded. Slowly, I twisted the knob, and suddenly, Jay was right next to me, as if in a protective state, or she just wanted to get back into the room first. She stood at the open end of the door. It creaked slightly. We expected it to do as it had done before when Jay had opened the door, but this time, instead of drawing it out long and slow, she swung it open so quickly it hit the side of the wall with a slight thud. After quickly surveying the threshold and the surrounding area, we both sighed in relief. There was nothing there. Emboldened, Jay grabbed my left wrist, and with her right, pulled the door completely closed. She always had to do everything first. We were back inside again, some moments later, our eyes having accustomed to the dark. She again got up the nerve to move at first, toward the stairs, and then toward another door on the far end of the mezzanine. "Come on," she ordered, rolling my eyes in vague protest as if, "Make up your mind." I nonetheless followed. Taking a sharp left, we marched right up to the door, closed firmly against our entrance. Hurriedly yet stealthily, she opened the massive oak door and then entered the room. It seemed darker and more ominous than the living room outside. It was the master bedroom. We both almost lost our nerve and backed out, as the gloom seemed to envelop us in a strangely thick murk. It was suddenly harder to breathe, as if something or someone had painted the walls with mildew, and that had tainted the air. Directly to the left was the walk-in closet our aunt told Jay about. It housed hundreds of very old dolls. It was the real reason my sister wanted to come here in the first place, and was determined to stay, despite the growing warnings to get out. Jay, however, was still not so easily convinced. Entering the closet while holding the flashlight, Jay turned it back on again and started scanning past the old hung clothes and onto the dolls above that were in a jumble on the shelves, stacked to the ceiling. Our aunt had been there previously and had gone through them. It was then that we heard something in the direction of the stairs again. Jay turned off the flashlight, waiting. After some moments of hearing nothing further, she shoved the flashlight into my hands and instructed me to shine the light on the dolls so she could go through them. The moment the flashlight was in my hand, we heard a sudden thud somewhere in front of us. Turning the light back on, swinging it wildly in search of the source of the noise, and seeing nothing, Jay said matter-of-factly, "It was the wind." I swear she must have thought I was the most brainless younger sister on the freaking planet to try to convince me and herself that the wind had suddenly materialized in the closet and caused the noise. What she didn't know was that I had seen a doll earlier and she was scanning the closet that had been hanging from the shelf and was now lying on the floor. It had been hanging by a thread of its hair and had decided at the most inopportune moment to fall. Either that or Wyatt or whatever it was chose for it to fall at exactly that moment was anyone's guess. When I told her whatever, she just glared. After all, being the older sister, she was supposed to be the one to make that discovery, not me. But then I was the one that read a lot of Sherlock Holmes, so I fancied myself to be the detective who would notice those finer things during an adventure, and she, like the pompous Inspector Lestrade, would usually characteristically miss them. Satisfied at the cause, I slowly scanned the vast collection of dolls, with their many shades of colored glass eyes, staring eerily back at us. One in particular had a single sapphire blue eye. It caught my attention. Long auburn hair covered it, making it seem almost alive. Some of the older dolls were known to have actual human hair. I wondered if any had actual human skin. I would have sworn it blinked at me. Holding the flashlight while keeping an eye out, Jay used a single step ladder and began searching the collection of dolls. Hearing the noise, I shook my head, my eyes blinking incredulously in disbelief, because here we were again, blocked from escape. One way in, one way out. Again I was distracted by the growing apprehension I felt standing in this claustrophobic place. While seriously trying to decide if I was going to stay with her or run like hell out of there. The answer would come swiftly enough if Jay hadn't grabbed my arm again. At the same time she grabbed me, she grabbed the doll that she'd had all along come to get. I suspected then that I was just someone she needed for backup. That was when we both again heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, moving up to where we were. Slow and methodical, stopping on each riser as if whoever or whatever was intently listening between the steps. We made not a sound. We were frozen in fear. I silently shut off the flashlight. The small amount of light that spilled in through the open door was coming through the waning sunlight of the window. What little light that could seep through afforded us just enough to look out through the open door. Jay and I suddenly got the same idea at the same moment. Moving swiftly yet silently, she reached out with the trembling outstretched fingers and closed the closet door. Both now of the same volition and in perfect unison, moved back, deeper into the inkiness of the walk-in closet, until our backs touched the wall. All the dolls in there with us made it even spookier, and I felt like a cat, in the position of knowing there was only one way out. Jay took my right hand in hers and held it tightly, as if holding on for dear life. Either that or she knew that if anything happened to me, Mother would probably kill her. I could feel the already almost endurable tension building. The waiting turned out to be both terrifying and exhilarating. The footsteps moved from the stairs to the floor, and were now moving slowly in our direction, still stopping occasionally, as if listening for the slightest sound. The only other sound I heard was my own ragged breathing. Reflexively, I put my hand across my mouth and breathed through my nose. After a few moments, I noticed that it had helped to calm me down. Jay took notice and did the same thing. Still, my heart thundered in my chest. I could feel each beat move my body. We were rooted to the spot, but mostly hidden in the darkness, at the very back of the closet, as the steps moved closer, nearly upinging our minds in terror and anticipation. Barely resisting the fight or flight reflex, we knew we must remain still and quiet, becoming like the dolls themselves. Time disappeared completely as our breathing slowed and our thoughts languished in an almost torpid state of indifference and fear, until we both heard the doorknob of the closet starting to turn. Involuntarily I gasped, and it was then that the door was flung open so violently it banged against the opposite wall and very nearly closed in on itself. Then it was suddenly and even more violently flung open again. A scream caught in my throat, leaving me speechless. Jay threw up her hands to cover her eyes and stifle her own, but it was clear that whatever it was knew we were in the closet, and was only yet toying with us. We stood there in near complete darkness, frozen in place, and hypnotically watched the door after it banged off the wall for a second time, almost close, and then slowly opened to reveal nothing. There was nothing there. No gut-wrenching, mind-numbing horror. No bowel-loosening, half-decomposed Papa Zombie freshly arisen from the grave, coughing out a, "Honey, I'm home." Not even some urban legend cryptid, proving once and for all that they really do exist, just before they eviscerate and then decapitate you. Nothing. Jay, her prize doll in hand, and she got what she came for, decided that it was time to finally get herself the hell out of there. She bolted. At first I was still cautious, expecting at any moment that we would come face to face with some otherworldly terror, like in the movies, but there was, thank God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, Muhammad, Buddha, Yahweh, or any other god, goddess, or gods you can think of, or if you're an atheist, the void. Nothing there. Feeling emboldened, and now free from Jay's vice-like grip on my wrist, her hand drenched in sweat, we ran for the steps. I, however, being much more agile, chose a shorter route. I turned a sharp left and leaped from the mezzanine, just missing an oversized chair, and landed with a solid thud on the hardwood floor, like a thoroughbred finishing first place at the Breeders' Cup steeplechase tournament in Foxville, Maryland. Not only had I the nerve to take the shorter way, but I was much faster than Jay ever was. I grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and swung the door open in one smooth moment, and hit the ground running before even hearing Jay behind me, running down the steps yelling, "Cat, slow down!" Yeah, right, I told myself, as I sped across the yard, jumping over and zigzagging around fallen branches, dead privet hedges, and broken picket fencing. Hell, I'd already reached the road and was doing my victory lap when Jay was just exiting down the front steps. As I was bent over catching my breath, she finally arrived, bitching about how I'd abandoned her, when she knew she was the one that left me. Projecting again. It was then that the front door to the house suddenly slammed violently shut, with a bang like a rifle, as though saying, "And stay out." Jay, finally shutting the hell up, turned and ran as I'd never seen her run before, and yeah, I did say the word hell out loud, not even looking back, as we peeled up the road to home. I easily kept pace, loping along like a strong, steady quarter horse, and she like some deranged lunatic, having escaped with her doll, the local sanitarium. No offense to any of the insane that happen to be on the loose out there in the world. It was almost dark when we got out of there. We both knew that we had tarried too long, but the flashlight gave us some comfort and helped us to calm our frazzled nerves. Once we calmed down, we discussed seriously what had happened, and I found myself shivering more than once, even though the heat from that day was still emanating off the concrete on Chico Road. A black friend came along in a pickup with his dad, listening to Al Green on an 8-track. I sang along while they gave us a ride the rest of the way. We were pretty close friends. Elijah jumped in the back with us, and we told him all about our adventure in the house on Chico Road. He ended up staying the night on the living room couch, and we in our beds at the back of the trailer. Jay didn't seem to be as scared now that she had had her prized doll. I, on the other hand, had my Shiloh, who was my best friend, there to meet me. As we talked, we came to the same conclusion that whatever was in the house was of the paranormal kind, our not having seen anyone, save the mice, when we entered. And as far as I knew at my young age, mice didn't turn doorknobs or slam doors with the strength of a Sasquatch. Could it have been the husband who died before, that still haunted the old house? And was the invitation we received to enter the house, and then enter the closet and the falling doll, the widow, who also after death took residence there? It took some time for me to reason that out before the sound of that last slam finally stopped echoing in my skull. Still, I could not understand how Jay could have selfishly bolted for the door, leaving me there alone, although in hindsight I was glad she had. I guess it was the only thing she could do when overcome with blind fear, calculating that at least one of us, her, she hoped, might get out of there alive. I guess our mother threatening to kill her if anything happened to me was a risk she was willing to take. Fortunately for both of us, I never told. There wasn't more to it than that. Later on, warm and cozy in bed, my Shiloh curled up in the crux of my arm. He revealed something to me, and probably to her as well, that when it came right down to it, it wasn't the we that mattered to her nearly as much as the me. We weren't nearly as close after that. I prayed to Christ and thanked him for helping me and Jay get out of there in our time of need, and for Elijah and his father being there to help us home before the storm hit. Shiloh purred, and I prayed to never be tempted to go into that house ever again, for any reason, especially if it was just for some silly adventure, or because Jay wanted an old doll and was willing to sacrifice one of us to get it. If the risk of life and limb somehow wasn't enough to keep us out, I thought, then an overly protective fucking house ghost sure as hell ought to be.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.